In order to understand completely the settlement and the nature of it, you've got to go back a few years to give you some context. Okay, and the context for that is there's what we call NAR. That's the abbreviation for the National Association of Realtors. The National Association of Realtors is the largest trade association in the United States of America. Over 1.5 million members pay their dues every year to NAR, National Association of Realtors. So remember that abbreviation, because we can talk about that, because there's several nuances to it. And what they had in place for the last 50 years that I can think of was a policy called the cooperative payment policy or cooperative commission policy, okay, which meant that when an agent would list a property for sale, they would offer it through the MLS, multiple listing service, not Major League Soccer, multiple listing service, right? And they would say, here's how much you're going to be paid, Mr. Buyer's agent, Mrs. Buyer's agent. This is what you'll be paid.
So like 2.5%,
So predetermined,
3%.
predetermined and set. Was it still negotiable? Yes, it's always been negotiable. Okay, but it was different because the seller would negotiate with the listing agent a
So
fee.
the listing agent would determine what the fees will be.
What the fees would be typically, but have to put it in writing, and the seller would agree to it for what a buyer's agent would be paid. Okay, now we'll fast forward. What this lawsuit was based on, i.e. the settlement, was the fact that they wanted to do away with, and they found that this was antitrust. It was an antitrust violation to have a set fee, pre-described, determined, to pay a buyer's agent. What the settlement did was say, you have to do away with that. They had a jury of 8 people. This was decided in Kansas City, Missouri. Of the jury members, not one person had sold or bought a house ever. And it was a jury that decided unequivocally and unanimously that the cooperative commission policy or compensation policy, they struck it down. That's the essence of the settlement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, now, essentially, probably the thought was that it doesn't make sense for the seller to pay the buyer's agent.
Well, here's what that looks like, and this is how it sort of was. And I'm ad-libbing here a little bit in paraphrasing what I don't pretend to be an attorney on either the plaintiff or defense counsel side. But here's what that kind of looks like. If I'm a seller and you're a buyer's agent, okay, in the prior days, prior to the settlement, I'm paying you to negotiate against me. How does that make sense? In a lot of ways, it didn't make sense. And the jury didn't make sense to them.
Yeah, because what could happen is that as a buyer agent, you might want to agree to a higher price because the seller is paying the fee, right?
That was part of the theory behind it, exactly. So in essence, what the thought was is that it would reduce the price of a home, make homes more affordable. It might reduce for buyers the price of a home, okay, in terms of either down payment or affordability. And also it would reduce the fees that a seller would have to pay, okay, to a buyer's agent. That was the thought behind it.
We're covering California issues, as you know. If you want us to cover the stories that are impacting your day-to-day life in California, reach out to me at siyamak@californiainsider.com. Now, what's the impact? We're hearing there is a lot of uncertainty about, because this was a rule for many, many years in the real estate space, right? This was the kind of understanding, the way.
As far back as I can remember, okay, so at least 50, 60 years, this is the way that real estate had been sold and the way that it was operating up until October of last year. And that jury decided and made all the difference in what they called the Sitzer-Burnett case versus NAR and NAR, National Association of Realtors, and a lot of other agencies across the country. As a result of that decision in the case, other companies, like a company called Anywhere is a holding company that basically operates Sotheby's, Century 21's, Coldwell Banker, and Better Homes and Garden, ERA, and some other companies. They ended up paying to settle their case. They paid $81 million, $83 million to get out of the case. So far, roughly speaking, the defendants in these cases have paid about $730 million.
Wow.
Okay? The attorneys from that are taking about $210 million themselves. And this became a class action lawsuit later on after the initial filings. What's interesting is Mr. Sitzer, who originated the lawsuit, just opened a real estate company.
Very interesting.
Isn't that interesting? Okay. I thought I'd throw that in because it's kind of an interesting thing, a little nuance that not very well publicized anywhere. So what that looked like is, in the past, here's the difference, okay? You, as a seller, were mandated to pay a buyer's agent. Today, that cooperative compensation policy is no longer. You are no longer mandated to pay a buyer's agent. You can if you choose, but it's voluntary.
And how does that work for the buyers? Can you tell us how does it work now?
Sure. Mechanically speaking, okay, for a moment, using form talk and things like that, without getting too nuanced in it, basically, for someone in my business, in the real estate industry, to show a house to their mother, their sister, their husband, their daughter, whoever it is, they must have completed a form called a Buyer Representation Broker Compensation Agreement. The acronym for that, or abbreviation, is BRBC. Okay? That must be signed before you tour a property if you've made an appointment to show it to somebody. Now, if you're going to an open house, it's not necessary. So there is a clear distinction between a buyer visiting an open house, where there's no BRBC. Sorry to use that acronym, but it's true. There's not required at all.
So in that one is usually the seller's agent, or it could be other agents there. But if somebody decides to show you a property, you have to sign an agreement with them.
That's correct. It's mandated. And on top of that, not only is it mandated by the settlement, and everybody agreed to, but it's also mandated in our local multiple listing service, MLS, that if you don't have it when you're showing a property, you actually could be fined. The fine start at $1,000 and go as high as $7,500 for repeat offenders.
Now, does it make it harder for the agents and buyers? Because sometimes, as a buyer, you may not want to commit right up front to an agent, like if the first time they're showing you, and then as an agent, probably it would be hard to get a buyer to sign that, right?
I think some buyers are balking at it, okay? Because I think some agents aren't explaining it correctly. This can be an exclusive contract. It can be non-exclusive. It can be for one property. It can be for 1 day. It can be for 2 days. What it can't do is be in excess of 3 months. And I've actually seen contracts come in now where they're trying to contract with the buyer for 12 months. That is unenforceable. Okay, so if I wanted to show you a property, I could say, here, you need to sign this form, and as soon as we're done seeing this property, we'll void the form. But you need the form in order to see the property executed. You need the form executed to see the property.
And why are they doing that? Is it to know exactly how much commission so you have to agree on all of that, right? How much commission you're willing to pay and all that, right?
And what I referred to earlier is a buyer representation broker compensation agreement, BRBC. It talks about and discusses in very clear language what the buyer will be paying the buyer's agent. So in compliance with the settlement, now let me just jump off that track for a minute and go to the settlement. National Association of Realtors settled with the plaintiffs in the action for $418 million. That settlement covered all of the agents in the entire country. It left 94 brokerages out of that settlement who had sold or had volume, if you will, of sales in excess of $2 billion. So there's not so happy brokerages around the country with their own association. Feel like they kind of left them out a little bit. Now, back on track. That settlement said these things have to be in effect by August the 17th. And that's where the big changes have taken place.
Of this year, of
this year, August 17, 2024. All of those changes now have taken place. So now we're starting to get evidence, anecdotal evidence of what's happening. We're hearing about things that are happening and the changes so that we can perform better and do better in the consumer's eyes. Our philosophy is customer first. Whatever they want, that's what we do. That's reasonable, of course, in accordance with the law.
So now there's another thought that comes into mind is it might be hard for the buyers to pay the commission, right? Is because the buyer is not really making any money. They have to come up with a down payment. And sometimes people struggling to come up with even 5%, 10% if they have unique kind of loans. Now they have to pay this 2.5%, 3%. How does that work?
You know, it's a great question because here's where there's some nuances and differences. On the form that I referred to, okay, the BRBC, and another form that it can accompany that called the SPBB, seller payment, okay, that's now you're going to include that form. Hold on, though. With the BRBC, you can say, A, I don't have the money, or I can't finance it. Therefore, I'm submitting what we call an SPBB, seller payment to broker compensation, basically. Okay?
So you can actually say,
And then-
I don't have the money, assign it to the seller, have the seller pay it.
That's correct. And then in that form, there's an avenue and path that is in compliance with the settlement, perfectly legal too, that says, I can't afford to pay it, I can't finance it, like an FHA buyer might, okay, with 3% down, or a VA buyer. VA recently adjusted their loan
can
programs
finance it, okay.
so you can finance it, but maybe it's not enough, and maybe they don't want to. So they say, here, I'm submitting this form. Mr. Seller, please pay my agent, the buyer's broker, a commission. And the seller can say yes or no. If the seller says no, then the agent has a decision to make. Do I represent the buyer for free at no cost, essentially? Or do I say I'm going to withdraw from the situation, which they have the right to do as an agent? And then that buyer could then be represented by either the other agent or no representation at all.